I still remember the feeling of staring at a page longer than I was actually reading it. Your eyes keep moving, the words keep passing by, but your mind quietly stops. Not because you found an answer, but because you found a question you were never supposed to ask. Maybe it happened during a sermon, maybe while reading alone late at night. Maybe someone made an argument that stayed in your head longer than you wanted. You tried to push it away because questioning something that has shaped your entire understanding of reality feels dangerous. Not physically dangerous, but psychologically dangerous. If your beliefs are connected to your family, your childhood, your closest relationships, your moral compass, then questioning even one part of them can feel like threatening your entire identity. That feeling alone explains why so many difficult conversations never happen. Most people assume they believe something because they examined the evidence. In reality, psychology repeatedly shows that human beings usually begin with belonging and only afterward construct explanations that protect that belonging. We are social creatures before we are rational creatures. We inherit languages before arguments. We inherit traditions before evidence. We inherit stories before we ever ask whether those stories should be interpreted literally, symbolically, historically, or spiritually. None of this proves that a belief is false. It simply reminds us that sincere conviction and objective truth are not automatically the same thing. That distinction matters because once we recognize it, a deeper question begins to emerge. If millions of intelligent people can sincerely disagree about the same sacred text, what exactly are they disagreeing about? Many discussions about the Bible quickly become debates over miracles, creation, prophecy, or morality. Those subjects receive enormous attention because they are dramatic. But there is another issue that quietly sits underneath almost every disagreement. It is not a contradiction that can simply be pointed to on one page. It is not a single archaeological discovery that settles everything. It is something more fundamental. The problem is interpretation. Not whether the words exist, but what those words actually mean. Think about how often people confidently say that the Bible clearly teaches something. Then think about how many churches disagree with each other while reading the same collection of books. If the meaning were always obvious, why has sincere disagreement persisted for centuries? Some see symbolic language, where others see literal history. Some understand certain commands as timeless, while others see them as deeply connected to ancient cultures. Some emphasize historical context. Others emphasize divine timelessness. Some focus on literary genres. Others approach every sentence with equal historical weight. Each side often believes the text itself is perfectly clear, while assuming the disagreement exists because someone else refuses to read honestly. Yet every group usually says exactly the same thing about every other group. This is where the psychological question becomes impossible to ignore. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to mistake familiarity for certainty. When an interpretation becomes normal inside a community, it eventually stops feeling like an interpretation at all. It simply becomes reality. Imagine growing up hearing one explanation every week for 20 years. By adulthood, you may not even realize alternative readings exist. Your confidence comes not from constantly re-examining the evidence, but from repeated exposure. The same mechanism appears in politics, culture, education, family traditions, and national identity. It is not unique to religion. Our brains conserve energy by accepting trusted frameworks instead of rebuilding every conclusion from the ground up. Without that shortcut, society could barely function, but every shortcut carries a cost. The cost is that inherited assumptions become almost invisible. We defend them without realizing we are defending them. That invisible process becomes especially powerful when eternal questions are involved. If someone suggests that your interpretation might be incomplete, your emotional reaction often arrives before your intellectual analysis. You feel threatened first and reason second. That is not because you are irrational. It is because identity is deeply emotional. Losing certainty feels similar to losing safety. This explains why conversations about Scripture often become surprisingly personal, even when nobody intended them to. The discussion is rarely just about ancient manuscripts. It becomes a discussion about family, purpose, community, trust, memory, and hope. Consider two friends reading the same passage. One concludes it is describing literal historical events. The other believes the passage communicates profound theological truths through symbolic storytelling. Both may spend years studying languages, history, archaeology, philosophy, and theology. Both may genuinely seek truth. Both may pray sincerely if they are believers, yet they reach different conclusions. Does that automatically mean one person is dishonest? Not necessarily. Interpretation always involves assumptions brought into the reading before the reading even begins. Those assumptions include views about history, language, divine revelation, genre, metaphor, culture, authorship, and the relationship between ancient audiences and modern readers. None of us approaches any text as a completely blank slate. We never have. The Bible itself contains poetry, wisdom literature, legal material, historical narratives, prophetic visions, letters, parables, songs, genealogies, and apocalyptic imagery. Most readers naturally adjust their expectations depending on genre in everyday life. Nobody reads a poem the same way they read a legal contract. Nobody reads satire the same way they read a newspaper report. The difficult question is determining where those boundaries belong inside Scripture. Scholars have debated that for generations, and thoughtful believers continue to reach different conclusions without abandoning faith itself. Others conclude that the diversity of interpretations points toward a more human origin for the text. Still others argue that divine revelation necessarily requires human interpretation because language itself cannot eliminate ambiguity. Notice what happened. The conversation became more complicated, not less. That complexity frustrates people because our minds crave clean answers. We like certainty because certainty reduces anxiety. Ambiguity demands humility, patience, and the willingness to admit that reality may resist simple conclusions. That resistance is uncomfortable, yet discomfort is often where genuine thinking begins. Imagine asking yourself a question you have never honestly entertained before, not because someone forced you to, but because curiosity quietly outweighed fear. How much of what you believe today would you still believe if you had been born somewhere else into another language, another culture, another century? It is an unsettling thought because it reveals how much circumstance shapes conviction. Again, that observation alone does not determine whether Christianity, Judaism, another religion, or no religion is ultimately true. It simply reminds us that every human being begins life inside a story they did not choose. At some point, each person faces the responsibility of deciding whether to remain inside that inherited story, revise it, deepen it, or leave it altogether. That decision is rarely as simple as outsiders imagine. People often describe belief as though it were merely accepting facts. But belief is entangled with trust. Trust cannot be measured with the same instruments we use to measure physical objects. Historical questions involve probabilities, sources, context, and interpretation. Philosophical questions involve coherence, meaning, and logic. Theological claims often extend beyond what historical methods alone can confirm or deny. Confusing those categories creates endless arguments where participants unknowingly answer different questions. One person asks whether a text is historically reliable. Another asks whether it is spiritually transformative. Another asks whether it reveals ultimate truth. Another asks whether its moral teachings improve society. These questions overlap, but they are not identical. Treating them as though they are the same guarantees misunderstanding. Perhaps the deepest problem nobody can fully explain is not simply why the Bible is interpreted differently. It is why human beings so desperately need certainty in places where certainty may always remain incomplete. We often imagine that if we could eliminate every unanswered question, peace would finally arrive. Yet history suggests something different. Every generation solves old questions only to discover deeper ones waiting underneath. That pattern appears in science, philosophy, politics, relationships, and religion alike. The search itself becomes part of what it means to be human. Maybe that is why the most intellectually honest people often sound less certain than the loudest voices in the room. They have discovered that reality is usually more layered than slogans allow. They understand that confidence can sometimes hide insecurity, while careful uncertainty can reflect genuine respect for complexity. That does not mean every conclusion is equally valid. Evidence still matters, reason still matters, historical research still matters, but humility matters too, because the moment we assume we have nothing left to learn, curiosity quietly dies. And when curiosity dies, understanding soon follows. If this conversation has challenged you to examine not only what you believe, but why you believe it, then stay with this journey. Subscribe if you want more conversations that value honest questions, careful thinking, and the courage to examine assumptions without fear. The conversation naturally shifts from the text itself to the people who have carried it across generations. Imagine sitting at a family dinner where 3 generations read the same passage aloud. The words are identical, yet each person quietly hears something different. The grandparent hears comfort because those verses carried them through grief. The parent hears responsibility because those verses shaped countless difficult decisions. The teenager hears confusion because the world outside the home seems to challenge almost every assumption those words appear to represent. Nobody is pretending. Nobody is necessarily acting in bad faith. Each person is bringing an entire lifetime of experiences into the act of reading. That simple scene reveals something profound about human psychology. We rarely approach evidence as detached observers. We approach it as people with memories, fears, hopes, disappointments, relationships, and identities that inevitably influence what captures our attention and what slips past unnoticed. This is not a weakness unique to religion. The same pattern appears whenever deeply held beliefs are involved. Political debates, scientific controversies, philosophical disagreements, even arguments within families often follow the same emotional rhythm. We notice information that reinforces the story we already believe, while demanding a much higher standard from information that challenges it. Psychologists describe this tendency as confirmation bias, but naming it does not magically free us from it. In fact, one of the most fascinating discoveries in modern psychology is that simply knowing about a bias does not prevent us from experiencing it. We often become skilled at spotting it in everyone except ourselves. That realization should make every serious conversation about Scripture more thoughtful. Instead of beginning with the assumption that only other people are influenced by emotion, we might begin by asking how our own assumptions shape what we see. That question is uncomfortable because it turns the spotlight inward rather than outward. It asks whether our confidence is built entirely on evidence or partly on familiarity, community, and personal experience. For some people, that examination strengthens faith because they discover that their convictions have survived careful scrutiny. For others, it reshapes faith into something less dependent on certainty and more dependent on trust. Others move away from belief altogether because they conclude the historical or philosophical evidence no longer supports their previous conclusions. These paths are dramatically different, yet they often begin with the same simple act of asking questions that previously felt forbidden. History itself illustrates why those questions are so persistent. The biblical texts emerged over many centuries in different cultural settings, under changing political realities, and through multiple literary forms. That does not automatically diminish their significance. On the contrary, many scholars argue that understanding those historical settings deepens appreciation for the texts because they become voices speaking into real human struggles rather than abstract statements floating outside history. Others emphasize theological continuity despite historical diversity. Still others focus on how communities preserved, interpreted, and transmitted these writings over time. These approaches frequently overlap, but they also produce different conclusions about what should be emphasized when reading the Bible today. None of those conversations disappear simply because someone insists that the answer is obvious. The existence of sincere disagreement itself remains one of the most interesting facts surrounding the text. If interpretation were effortless, libraries filled with biblical scholarship would scarcely exist. Instead, generation after generation continues returning to the same pages, discovering new insights while continuing old debates. That persistence suggests something remarkable. The Bible has endured not because every reader reaches identical conclusions, but because it continues provoking reflection across cultures, languages, and centuries. Even those who reject its religious authority often acknowledge its immense historical, literary, and cultural influence. Likewise, many believers readily admit that difficult passages deserve careful study rather than simplistic explanations. Perhaps that is where the real challenge lies. The desire for immediate certainty can tempt us into accepting answers that are emotionally satisfying before asking whether they are intellectually adequate. Yet some questions resist quick resolution. They require patience, historical awareness, philosophical clarity, and the humility to distinguish between what we know with confidence, what we reasonably infer, and what ultimately remains a matter of faith or personal judgment. That distinction is easy to describe, but remarkably difficult to practice because certainty feels emotionally rewarding. It gives us the comforting illusion that every important mystery has already been solved. Reality rarely cooperates with that desire. Human existence is filled with unanswered questions about consciousness, morality, suffering, meaning, and purpose. Religious belief attempts to address many of those questions, but it does not eliminate the complexity surrounding them. Neither does skepticism automatically resolve them. Both belief and disbelief involve assumptions about reality that extend beyond what any single piece of evidence can conclusively establish. Recognizing that fact does not weaken honest inquiry. It strengthens it by encouraging intellectual humility instead of overconfidence. Perhaps the problem that nobody can fully explain is not merely found within the pages of the Bible, but within ourselves. We long for absolute certainty while living in a world that continually confronts us with ambiguity. We seek final answers, even as every answer opens another question. We want reality to fit neatly inside the boundaries of our preferred worldview, yet reality repeatedly proves larger than our categories. Whether someone ultimately embraces faith, revises it, or rejects it, that tension remains part of the human experience. The challenge is not simply deciding what to believe, it is learning how to pursue truth without allowing fear, pride, or social pressure to become the final authority over our thinking. If there is one lesson worth carrying forward, it is that honest inquiry demands both courage and restraint. The courage to question what feels unquestionable, and the restraint to avoid claiming certainty where the evidence leaves room for genuine disagreement. Those qualities rarely produce the loudest voices, but they often produce the deepest understanding. There is another reason this question refuses to disappear, and it has very little to do with ancient history. It has everything to do with the way human beings construct meaning. Imagine losing someone you love. Imagine watching a relationship collapse after years of investment. Imagine working honestly, only to see someone less principled succeed while you struggle. In moments like those, people are rarely searching for abstract philosophy. They are searching for a framework that explains why reality feels so unfair. Every civilization has attempted to answer that need. Every culture has developed stories that help people understand suffering, justice, hope, guilt, and purpose. The remarkable influence of the Bible is inseparable from its ability to speak into those universal experiences. That is true regardless of whether someone approaches it primarily as divine revelation, as an extraordinary collection of ancient literature, or as one of history's most influential cultural texts. Yet this same power creates a unique challenge. The more personally meaningful a text becomes, the harder it is to separate emotional attachment from historical evaluation. That does not mean emotional attachment makes someone's conclusions invalid. It simply means that emotional investment raises the stakes of every question. Few people become angry when someone critiques an old engineering manual, but challenge a sacred text, and the conversation often becomes deeply personal because people hear more than criticism of words on a page. They hear criticism of parents who taught them those words. They hear criticism of communities that supported them during hardship. They hear criticism of moments that gave them hope when life seemed unbearable. Understanding that emotional dimension does not settle the intellectual debate, but it explains why these discussions often generate far more heat than light. It also reminds us that genuine dialogue requires recognizing the humanity of the person across from us, even when we strongly disagree with their conclusions. One of the most fascinating aspects of biblical interpretation is that thoughtful readers often arrive at different answers while using many of the same sources. They examine ancient languages, compare manuscripts, study archaeology, analyze literary structures, and read historical records. Yet they weigh that evidence differently. Some conclude the cumulative evidence strongly supports traditional understandings. Others conclude that the evidence points toward more complex historical development. Still others find themselves somewhere between those positions, convinced that faith and historical investigation answer different kinds of questions. That diversity of conclusions can feel frustrating if we expect evidence to eliminate every disagreement. But disagreement alone is not proof that no answer exists. In every field involving incomplete historical evidence, reasonable scholars can disagree about probabilities while sharing the same commitment to careful research. The ancient world rarely provides the kind of complete documentation that modern readers wish it had preserved. Historians constantly work with fragments, comparisons, context, and inference. The Bible is studied within that broader reality. Some events receive stronger historical support than others. Some passages are widely understood in similar ways, while others remain subjects of ongoing debate. Recognizing those differences is not an attack on the text. It is part of taking both history and interpretation seriously. Perhaps that is why the most enduring conversations are rarely driven by people who claim to possess every answer. They are driven by people willing to keep asking better questions. Questions have an unusual power. A statement often ends a conversation. A thoughtful question begins one. It invites reflection instead of demanding surrender. It exposes assumptions without immediately replacing them with new dogmas. In that sense, the real challenge presented by the Bible may not be whether every reader reaches identical conclusions. It may be whether readers are willing to examine both the text and themselves with equal honesty. Reading any influential work changes depending on the reader's posture. Someone searching only for confirmation will usually find confirmation. Someone searching only for flaws will usually find flaws. Someone willing to wrestle with complexity may discover something far more valuable than immediate certainty: intellectual humility. That humility is not weakness. It is the recognition that reality often exceeds our preferred explanations. Throughout history, many breakthroughs began when someone became willing to admit that an inherited assumption deserved another look. That willingness transformed science, philosophy, politics, and ethics. It has also shaped religious thought itself. Traditions evolve not because every previous generation was entirely mistaken, but because sincere people continue asking how ancient truths should be understood in changing circumstances. Whether one ultimately concludes that the Bible is uniquely inspired, historically mixed, primarily symbolic, or something else entirely, the process of asking those questions honestly can reshape the way one approaches every other important belief. It teaches caution toward easy certainty, respect for evidence, awareness of psychological bias, and appreciation for the complexity of human experience. Those lessons extend far beyond religion. They influence how we judge other people, how we evaluate information online, how we respond to disagreement, and how willing we are to admit when our own understanding remains incomplete. In an age overflowing with confident opinions, perhaps the rarest quality is not intelligence, but intellectual integrity. The willingness to follow evidence where it leads while remaining humble about the limits of one's own perspective. That may never produce universal agreement, but it creates something arguably more valuable. A conversation grounded in curiosity rather than fear, in careful reasoning rather than reflexive certainty, and in the recognition that the pursuit of truth is often more demanding than the comfort of having quick answers.